When I watched my wife's affair partner point at me from the witness stand and call me a controlling, manipulative abuser, I didn't flinch. I'd been preparing for this moment for 8 months. What he didn't know, what my wife didn't know, was that my therapist had documented every single session where the truth came out, including the text messages where she threatened to kill herself if I ever left her. Welcome to Cheating Story Exposed. Real stories, real justice, no sugarcoating. You know what? I notice many of you watching haven't hit that subscribe button yet. Here's the thing, we drop stories like this every single day. Stories about people who got played, got smart, and got even. If you want to see how these situations really end, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. My name is Garrett Mitchell. I'm 42 years old, a civil engineer with a mid-sized consulting firm in Portland. When I married Claudia 7 years ago, I thought I'd found my partner for life. She was passionate, creative, worked in marketing, had this incredible energy that drew people in. For the first few years, we were solid. We traveled. We talked about kids. We built a life. The cracks started showing around year 4. Claudia became distant. She'd snap at small things. She'd accuse me of not understanding her creative process when I asked about her day. I suggested couples therapy. She refused. I suggested she see someone individually. She laughed it off. Eventually, I started seeing a therapist myself, Dr. Helen Carver. That decision saved my life. I started seeing Dr. Carver because I genuinely thought I might be the problem. Claudia had this way of making me question myself. She'd tell me I was too logical, too cold, that I didn't understand emotional depth. When she'd have an outburst, she'd later tell me I'd triggered her by being dismissive. I'd replay conversations in my head wondering if I'd actually been cruel without. Realizing it, Dr. Carver helped me see patterns. She'd ask me to describe specific incidents. I'd tell her about the time Claudia screamed at me for 20 minutes because I'd suggested we save money instead of taking a spontaneous weekend trip. Or the time she'd thrown her phone at the wall because I'd been working late on a deadline. Dr. Carver would listen carefully and then ask me questions that made me think. Was I actually being dismissive, or was I being punished for having boundaries? Was I cold, or was I simply not responding to manipulation the way Claudia wanted? One evening, about 18 months into therapy, I came home from work and found Claudia sitting on the couch, crying. I asked what was wrong. She looked up at me with this devastated expression and said if I ever left her, she didn't know if she could go on living, just like that, out of nowhere. I sat down, confused, and asked where this was coming from. She said she could feel me pulling away. She said she knew I was talking to someone, my therapist, and poisoning myself against her. I tried to reassure her. I told her therapy was helping me be a better partner. She grabbed my hand and said she needed me to promise I'd never leave. The intensity scared me. I told her I wasn't planning to leave, but I couldn't promise something unconditional like that without understanding what was happening between us. She started sobbing harder. Then she said it. If you leave me, Garrett, I'll end it. I won't be able to live without you. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told Dr. Carver everything. She asked if Claudia had made threats like this before. I realized she had, but always subtly. Little comments about not wanting to exist if I wasn't there. Jokes about how she'd drive off a bridge if I ever stopped loving her. Dr. Carver asked if she could document this pattern. I said yes. She explained that emotional manipulation involving suicide threats was serious, and that she needed to keep detailed records for my protection. Over the next few months, the threats escalated. Claudia started sending me texts during the day, long, rambling messages about how empty she'd feel if I wasn't in her life, how she'd looked up methods, how she'd written notes. I saved everything. I forwarded them all to Dr. Carver. She told me this was textbook coercive control and that I needed to consider my safety and my options. I started noticing other things. Claudia was on her phone constantly. She'd smile at messages and then close the screen when I walked by. She started dressing differently, going to the gym more. She'd mention a new friend from her marketing agency, someone named Terrence who really understood her creative vision. I didn't think much of it at first. Then she started coming home later. Business dinners, networking events, project launches. I didn't want to be that husband, the suspicious one, the controlling one she kept accusing me of being, but something felt off. One night after she'd come home at midnight claiming a client meeting ran late, I checked our phone records online. There were hundreds of texts and calls to one number. I ran it through a reverse lookup. Terrence Holbrook, marketing director at her agency. I sat with that information for a week. I didn't confront her. Instead, I scheduled an extra session with Dr. Carver. I told her about the phone records. She asked how I was feeling. I told her I felt like I was losing my mind. Like I was becoming the paranoid, controlling person Claudia said I was. Dr. Carver looked at me seriously and said that discovering evidence of deception doesn't make you controlling. It makes you aware. She suggested I consult with an attorney before doing anything. Not to file for divorce necessarily, but to understand my options and protect myself. I took her advice. I met with Richard Brennan, a family law attorney with a reputation for handling complex cases. I showed him the phone records. I showed him the text messages from Claudia about suicide. He listened carefully and then told me something that changed everything. Richard said that in contentious divorces, especially ones involving affairs, the unfaithful spouse often projects their behavior onto the innocent party. They'll claim abuse, control, manipulation, anything to deflect from their own actions and gain advantage in proceedings. He said I needed to document everything, keep records, gather evidence. Prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. I followed his advice. I started keeping a journal. I backed up all our financial records. I documented every time Claudia made a threat or had an outburst. I kept copies of everything on a secure cloud drive that only I could access. I wasn't planning to file for divorce, but I was building a defense in case she did. 2 months later, Claudia asked for a divorce. She said she'd been unhappy for years. She said I'd never truly understood her. She said she needed someone who could meet her emotional needs. She didn't mention Terrence. I didn't mention that I knew about him. I just said I was sad it had come to this, but if that's what she wanted, we'd work through it respectfully. She seemed relieved. Almost too relieved. Like she'd expected me to fight or beg or break down. I didn't give her that. I stayed calm. I told her I'd have my attorney contact hers to begin the process. Her expression flickered with something, maybe disappointment that I wasn't falling apart. I couldn't tell. Within a week, I received a call from Richard. Claudia's attorney had sent over initial papers. Standard stuff, but there was a request for a temporary restraining order claiming I'd been emotionally abusive and controlling throughout the marriage. Richard wasn't surprised. He said it was a common tactic. Paint the husband as the bad guy to gain sympathy and leverage. I was furious. Not loud, explosive fury. Cold, calculated fury. I'd spent years questioning myself. Because of her accusations, and now she was trying to make them legally official. Richard told me to stay calm. We had evidence. We had documentation. We had Dr. Carver's records. The truth would come out. The restraining order hearing was brief. Claudia's attorney presented her claims. I stayed controlled and professional. Richard presented my therapist's letters confirming that I'd been in treatment to deal with emotional abuse from Claudia, not the other way around. The judge denied the restraining order. Claudia looked stunned. Her attorney looked frustrated. That's when things got nasty. Claudia's legal strategy shifted. If she couldn't paint me as abusive, she'd paint me as unstable. Her attorney filed motions claiming I was undergoing mental health treatment that made me unfit for joint decisions during divorce proceedings. They wanted to delay and complicate everything. Richard warned me they were stalling, trying to drain my resources and energy. I didn't bend. I kept going to work. I kept seeing Dr. Carver. I kept documenting everything. And then 3 months into the divorce process, Claudia made a critical mistake. She moved Terrence into our house, the house we still jointly owned. The house we'd agreed would be sold as part of the settlement. Richard immediately filed a motion. You can't move your affair partner into marital property during proceedings. It's a violation of the separation agreement and shows bad faith. The judge agreed and ordered Terrence out. But more importantly, it officially established the affair on record. Claudia couldn't deny it anymore. That's when her attorney made an interesting move. They filed a motion to have Terrence testify as a character witness. They claimed he could speak to my controlling behavior because he'd witnessed how I'd treated Claudia through her stories and experiences. Richard was skeptical. Character witnesses were usually family or long-time friends. Having your affair partner testify seemed desperate, but the judge allowed it. And that's how I ended up sitting in a courtroom watching the man my wife had been sleeping with take the stand and call me an abuser. Terrence was composed, professional. He wore a nice suit. He spoke clearly. He told the court he'd known Claudia for 2 years through work. He said she'd confided in him about her marriage struggles. He painted a picture of me as someone who controlled her finances, monitored her phone, isolated her from friends, made her feel small. It was all lies, calculated, specific lies that sounded plausible enough to create doubt. I watched Claudia's attorney nod along. I watched the court reporter type every word. and I stayed perfectly still because I knew what was coming. When Richard stood up for cross-examination, he didn't attack. He just asked clarifying questions. How long had Terrence known Claudia? 2 years. How often did they interact? Daily at work and socially outside work. When did their relationship become romantic? Terrence hesitated. Claudia's attorney objected. The judge overruled. Terrence admitted they'd begun dating around the time the separation started. Richard nodded. Then he asked if Terrence had ever met me personally before the separation. No. Had he ever witnessed me interacting with Claudia directly? No. So all his testimony was based on what Claudia had told him? Yes. Richard thanked him and sat down. It seemed anticlimactic. Claudia's attorney looked pleased. They'd gotten their narrative into the record, but Richard had laid groundwork. He'd established that Terrence's testimony was hearsay, filtered through Claudia's perspective. Now came our turn. Richard called Dr. Helen Carver to the stand. Claudia's attorney objected immediately. Therapist-patient privilege. The judge asked Richard to clarify. Richard explained that I had signed a full waiver allowing Dr. Carver to testify specifically about documented instances of emotional abuse and manipulation. I'd experienced. The waiver was on file. The judge allowed it. Dr. Carver took the stand. She was calm, professional, credible. She explained she'd been treating me for 2 years. She explained I'd initially come to her believing I might be the problem in my marriage. She explained that over time, through documented sessions, a clear pattern of emotional manipulation and coercive control from my wife had emerged. Claudia's attorney tried to interrupt. Richard calmly asked Dr. Carver to describe specific documented incidents. She pulled out her notes. Patient confidentiality had been waived. Everything was admissible. Dr. Carver described the suicide threats. She read from her notes. Patient reported that spouse stated, "If you leave me, I'll end it. I won't be able to live without you." This occurred on March 14th. Patient showed visible distress and confusion about how to respond. She described another session. Patient shared text messages from spouse containing explicit threats of self-harm if he did not cancel therapy appointments. Spouse claimed therapy was poisoning patient against her. Patient expressed feeling trapped and responsible for spouse's emotional state. The courtroom was silent. Claudia's attorney looked uncomfortable. Claudia stared at the table. Richard asked Dr. Carver if she documented these text messages. She said yes. Richard asked if he could enter them into evidence. The judge allowed it. Printouts of text messages appeared on the screen. Claudia's words, her threats, her manipulation, all time-stamped, all saved. The judge read through them carefully. Then he asked Richard to continue. Richard asked Dr. Carver if she believed I exhibited controlling behavior toward my wife. Dr. Carver said no. She said I'd exhibited appropriate boundaries in response to manipulative behavior. She said I'd sought help to understand if I was the problem, which showed self-awareness and responsibility, not control. She said the evidence suggested I was the victim of emotional abuse, not the perpetrator. Claudia's attorney tried to salvage it during cross-examination. Wasn't it possible I'd manipulated Dr. Carver? Wasn't it possible I'd fabricated messages? Dr. Carver calmly explained that she'd seen the messages in real time, that I'd forwarded them directly from my phone during sessions, that she'd watched my emotional responses and found them consistent with someone experiencing genuine distress, not someone performing. The attorney pushed harder. Wasn't it true that seeking therapy could itself be a form of manipulation, building a paper trail to use against a spouse later? Dr. Carver looked at her directly and said that in her 20 years of clinical practice, she'd never seen an abuse victim seek therapy as a tactical maneuver. Abusers don't build documented records of their own supposed wrongdoing. Victims seek help because they're suffering. The judge called for a recess. When we returned, Claudia's attorney requested to approach the bench. There was a hushed conversation. When they stepped back, the attorney announced that Claudia wished to withdraw her claims of controlling behavior and emotional abuse. They'd focus solely on asset division moving forward. Richard didn't gloat. He simply nodded. The judge looked at Claudia and asked if she understood she was withdrawing serious allegations. She nodded, barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge made a note. The hearing continued, but the energy had shifted completely. Over the next 2 months, the divorce proceedings moved quickly. Without the abuse allegations, there was no basis for Claudia to claim she deserved more than 50% of assets due to trauma or need for therapy expenses. We split everything down the middle. The house sold. Accounts divided. It was clean. Terrence stopped appearing at hearings. I later heard through mutual connections that he'd broken up with Claudia about a month after the therapist's testimony. Apparently, watching your girlfriend's emotional manipulation tactics exposed in court makes you wonder what else she might be manipulating. Can't imagine why he'd think that. Claudia sent me one email after everything finalized. It was short. She said she was sorry things ended the way they did. She said she hoped I'd find happiness. She didn't acknowledge the lies. She didn't acknowledge the manipulation. She just said sorry things ended badly, like it was mutual and unfortunate rather than a consequence of her choices. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Richard had advised me that any communication at that point could only create problems. The divorce was final. We were legally strangers. I let it stay that way, Doctor. Carver and I continued therapy for another 6 months after the divorce. We worked through the aftermath, the anger, the sense of betrayal. The weird guilt that came from feeling relieved it was over. She helped me see that my decision to seek help, to document everything, to stay calm and strategic, those weren't cold or calculated in a negative way. They were survival skills. They were self-protection. She also helped me see patterns I needed to watch for in future relationships. The love bombing at the beginning. The gradual isolation disguised as intimacy. The accusations that make you question yourself. The threats that keep you tethered out of fear. I learned what emotional abuse looked like. I learned I'd survived it. And I learned I'd never accept it again. A year after the divorce finalized, I was at a work conference in Seattle. I ran into Terrence in the hotel bar. He was there for a different event. We recognized each other. It was awkward for about 5 seconds. Then he asked if he could buy me a drink. I almost said no. Then I figured, why not? I was curious. We sat at the bar. He ordered whiskey. I ordered the same. He was quiet for a moment, then he said he owed me an apology. I didn't respond. He continued. He said he'd believed everything Claudia told him. He said she'd painted this picture of a controlling, cold husband who didn't appreciate her. He said he genuinely thought he was helping her escape something bad. Then he said after the court hearing, things changed. Claudia started doing to him what she'd apparently done to me. Threats about leaving. Accusations that he wasn't supportive enough. Wild mood swings where she'd accuse him of not loving her properly. He said it took him 3 months to get out, and even then she'd sent him dozens of messages about how he'd destroyed her. He looked at me and said he finally understood what had actually happened in my marriage. He said he was sorry for testifying against me. He said he'd been used, and he'd helped someone weaponize lies against an innocent person. I took a sip of whiskey. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I also told him I didn't need his apology. What happened in court wasn't about him. It was about Claudia's choices and my preparation. He'd been a pawn, a tool. I didn't hold it against him, but I also didn't need his guilt to feel validated. He nodded. We sat there for a few more minutes in silence. Then he finished his drink, shook my hand, and left. I never saw him again. That interaction gave me something I didn't know I needed. Confirmation. External validation that I hadn't imagined it. That I hadn't been crazy or paranoid or overly sensitive. Someone else had experienced the exact same patterns and recognized them. It wasn't about feeling superior or vindicated. It was about knowing the truth was the truth, regardless of who tried to rewrite it. 2 years after the divorce, I met someone new. Her name is Renee. She's a landscape architect. We met through a hiking group. She's kind, straightforward, independent. Early on, I told her about my previous marriage. Not in dramatic detail, but enough that she understood I'd been through something difficult, and I'd learned from it. She appreciated that I was honest. She told me about her own past, a relationship where she'd been cheated on and gaslit for months before she finally had proof and ended it. We bonded over understanding what betrayal does to your ability to trust and how you have to actively choose to rebuild that capacity. Renee and I have been together for a year now. We're taking it slow. No rushing into marriage, no performative commitment. Just building something real based on honesty, respect, and actual compatibility. She's never threatened me, never accused me of being too logical or too cold. She appreciates that I think before I react. She values that I'm stable. I still see Dr. Carver occasionally. Not weekly anymore, just check-ins every few months. She's proud of how I've rebuilt. She reminds me that what I went through wasn't just about surviving a bad marriage. It was about learning to trust myself again, to trust my perceptions, to trust that setting boundaries doesn't make you the villain. I think about Claudia sometimes. Not often, but occasionally. I wonder if she ever got help, if she ever recognized the patterns, if she ever stopped blaming everyone else for her unhappiness. I don't wish her harm. I don't wish her suffering. I just hope she's not doing to someone else what she did to me and Terrence. But mostly I don't think about her at all. That chapter is closed. The book is on the shelf. I've moved on to a new story, one where I'm not constantly defending myself or questioning my reality. One where I'm just living, the courtroom moment, watching my therapist calmly dismantle Claudia's false narrative with documented evidence. That moment wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about reclaiming truth. It was about showing that lies, no matter how convincing, eventually hit the wall of documentation and reality. Claudia's affair partner could testify all he wanted about my supposed controlling behavior. He could paint whatever picture he'd been fed. But he couldn't compete with timestamp text messages, therapy notes, a 2-year paper trail of documented manipulation. The truth didn't need drama, it just needed evidence. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry about what happened, if I hate Claudia or Terrence or the whole situation. Honestly, no, I'm grateful. That sounds strange, but it's true. I'm grateful I had the sense to seek help. I'm grateful Dr. Carver was thorough. I'm grateful Richard knew exactly how these cases unfold. I'm grateful I stayed calm and strategic instead of reactive and emotional. Because here's what I learned. The system rewards preparation. Life rewards patience. Truth rewards documentation. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room to win. You just have to be the most prepared. When Claudia made her accusations, she was counting on emotion trumping evidence. She was counting on people believing her tears and her story. She was counting on me not having proof. She miscalculated. She'd spent years manipulating me with threats and accusations, but she'd never considered that I'd document it, that I'd prepare for this exact scenario. And when Terrence took the stand, he was counting on character testimony being enough. He thought he could paint me as a villain because Claudia had painted me that way for him. He didn't consider that his entire testimony was based on one person's biased narrative. Richard dismantled that in 3 questions. The moment Dr. Carver started reading from her notes, the whole courtroom shifted. You could feel it. Claudia's attorney knew it was over. The judge's expression changed from neutral to concerned. Even Terrence, still sitting in the gallery, looked uncomfortable, because suddenly the story had evidence. Suddenly there were timestamps and documentation and professional observations that couldn't be explained away. That's the moment I'd been building toward for 8 months, not with revenge in mind. Not with some grand plan to destroy Claudia, just with the simple goal of protecting the truth, of making sure that if she tried to rewrite history, there'd be a record that said otherwise, and it worked. The allegations were withdrawn. The divorce proceeded fairly. I walked away with my reputation intact and my future unobstructed. No one who matters believes I was controlling or abusive. The legal record shows otherwise. That's all I needed. I'm 44 now. I've got a career I'm proud of. A relationship built on honesty. Friendships I've maintained and strengthened. A life that's mine, not shadowed by someone else's manipulation. When I look back at that courtroom moment, watching my wife's lies crumble against documented reality, I don't feel triumphant. I feel relieved that I trusted myself enough to seek help. Relieved that I prepared instead of panicked. Relieved that the truth, when properly documented, is unshakable. Relieved that I'm on the other side of it, building something better. If you're in a situation where someone's making you question your reality, document it. If someone's threatening self-harm to control you, tell a professional. If you think you might be the problem, seek help and let an objective expert assess the situation. Don't assume you're wrong just because someone tells you that you are. And if you ever end up in court facing false accusations, make sure you've done the work beforehand. Make sure you've got evidence. Make sure you've got records. Because emotions are powerful, but documentation is undeniable. The judge didn't rule in my favor because he liked me better. He ruled based on evidence. Dr. Carver's testimony wasn't persuasive because she was charming. It was persuasive because she had notes, dates, messages, and professional observations. Claudia's story fell apart not because she was a bad actress, but because there was a paper trail proving it was fiction. That's the lesson. That's what I walked away with. Preparation beats performance. Truth beats narrative. Evidence beats emotion. Every single time. I'm grateful for Dr. Carver. I'm grateful for Richard. I'm grateful for my own instinct to document and prepare instead of ignoring and hoping. Those decisions saved me from years of legal battles, financial ruin, and a destroyed reputation, and now I'm here, building a life with Renee, working on projects I care about. spending time with friends who have stuck by me, living without constantly defending myself. That's the real victory. Not the courtroom moment, but the life that came after. Claudia's affair partner testified I was controlling. My therapist read texts where she threatened suicide if I left. The truth won. And I moved on. That's the story. That's what happened. And that's why I'll never regret seeking help, documenting everything, and staying strategic when chaos tried to consume me. Because at the end of the day, you can't argue with evidence. You can't rewrite documented history. You can't manipulate a paper trail. And when someone tries and fails and watches their false narrative collapse in a courtroom, that's not revenge. That's just reality catching up. I didn't destroy Claudia. She destroyed her own credibility. I just made sure the truth was on record when she tried to destroy mine. And that made all the difference.